right, let's jump right in. We're going to talk about something that's quietly working behind the scenes, but is absolutely reshaping our entire global economy. I'm talking about global government debt. It is a massive, massive story, and we're going to break it all down using the latest numbers from the IMF. We all remember what happened during the pandemic, right? Governments everywhere just opened up the spending floodgates. And it really felt like we hit this peak, a huge mountain with debt for sure, but one we figured we'd start climbing down from once things settled. But here's the kicker. What if that wasn't the peak at all? What if it was just, base camp for an even bigger climb? That's exactly the question the International Monetary Fund is digging into right now. And here's their answer. A staggering 99.6%. That's where the IMF projects global public debt is headed by the year 2030. Think about that for a second. That's almost 100% of global GDP. It's actually higher than the peak we saw during the pandemic. So that's where we're headed. The big takeaway here is that this whole debt theme, it isn't going away. In fact, it's getting bigger. So let's break down what this new debt peak really means and, more importantly, why it matters to you. All right, first up, a new debt peak. We're talking about surpassing the pandemic highs, which, as you can imagine, is a pretty big deal. Okay, so just look at this unrelenting climb. It's pretty wild. Before the pandemic, back in 2019, we were at about 84%. Fast forward to today, and we're already over 92%. But the really crucial part is the projection, almost 100% by 2030. This isn't just some blip on the radar, folks. This is a sustained structural trend. So what's driving this relentless rise? Well, a huge part of the story is what we're calling the Great Fiscal Divide. The world's economic giants are taking two totally different paths. They are just not on the same page at all. So path number one is pretty simple: more spending. And who's leading the charge? The US and China. They're essentially keeping their foot pressed firmly on the fiscal accelerator. Then you've got path number two: less spending. And this is where you'll find the euro area. They're trying to do the exact opposite: pump the brakes, pull back a bit. It's a classic case of what economists call fiscal consolidation. And this table just lays it all out, plain as day. Look at the fiscal deficit for the US and China. Both are at a whopping 7.3%. Crazy high. But then look at the euro area, much lower at 3.1%. What's really telling, though, is this fiscal impulse column. A positive number, like for the US and the euro area, means they're actually adding more stimulus than the year before. China's is negative, which means they're tightening the belt just a little. It just goes to show how differently everyone is playing the game right now. Okay, so let's talk about navigating the biggest risks here. Because when the world's major economies start pulling in opposite directions, well, that divergence can create some real danger. So you have to wonder, in a really severe scenario, just how bad could this all get? Well, the IMF actually ran the numbers on that. They stress tested this whole situation to see what a worst-case scenario might look like. And the answer is 117%. No, that's not a typo. In what they call a severe adverse scenario, global debt could literally explode to 117% of GDP by 2027. To put that in perspective, we're talking about levels we haven't seen since the end of World War II. It's just staggering. So what could possibly trigger a crisis that severe? Well, it's not just one thing. It's more like a perfect storm, a cocktail of risks. We're talking about financial conditions suddenly getting way tighter and more volatile. Or maybe some unexpected policy shock, like a new wave of higher tariffs. Escalating geopolitical tensions are a huge one. And another big worry is disruptive capital outflows, where investors just yank their money out of emerging markets. Any one of these could be the spark. Now, one of the biggest hidden dangers in all this debt is something economists call the crowding out effect. It's actually a pretty simple idea, but its impact is massive. Basically, when governments have to spend more and more money just on interest payments for their debt, there's less money left for everything else. And here's exactly how that squeeze works. First, those government interest payments start to rise, sometimes really sharply. Second, that means a much bigger chunk of the entire national budget gets eaten up just by servicing the debt. And third, what gets cut? Funding for public investment and social benefits. Things like roads, schools, healthcare. They all get squeezed. The debt literally crowds out the stuff we all rely on. And believe it or not, this whole crowding out problem is probably gonna get worse. We're heading into a long-term squeeze. And why? because governments are facing a whole new set of pressures that are putting a huge strain on their budgets. And the new cost of security is a perfect example. Look at this chart of European defense spending. It's already up significantly just since 2020. And the key thing to realize is this isn't a one-time thing. Geopolitical tensions are forcing a permanent increase in military budgets. This is a brand new structural burden that's here to stay. So you can see the trade-offs ahead, right? Governments are stuck between a rock and a hard place. They have to fund new defense needs. They have to manage the ever-rising costs of pensions and healthcare for aging populations. They're supposed to invest in infrastructure and the green energy transition. And they have to do all of that while somehow, some way, trying to get all this debt under control. It's an incredibly difficult balancing act. All right, so why does all this matter? I know it can feel a bit abstract talking about global policy, but this has real-world consequences, from the global economy all the way down to your portfolio. So the macroeconomic impact is pretty clear. All this fiscal strain creates major headwinds for global growth. That means a slower economy, less expansion, and lower productivity. It can also lead to stickier inflation, the kind that's really hard to get rid of. And what about interest rates? Well, it puts central banks in a tough spot, often forcing them to keep rates higher for longer, which keeps borrowing costs high for everyone. And this quote from an analyst report really just nails it. The structural rise in interest expenses is the primary threat to fiscal flexibility globally. That's the key takeaway. It's the rising cost of the debt itself that's becoming the biggest problem. It's like a straitjacket for policymakers. But it's not all doom and gloom. This challenging environment is actually creating some clear investment themes. Because governments have to spend money in certain areas, it makes things like defense, infrastructure, and the energy transition really clear policy priorities. These are areas that are going to see a lot of focus and a lot of funding in the years ahead. And that brings us to the big final question. With debt rising and all these new pressures mounting, who's going to end up paying for the future? I mean, the money has to come from somewhere, right? So who ultimately foots the bill? Is it going to be us through higher taxes or through fewer public services? Or are we just kicking the can down the road for future generations to deal with?